Hello, and welcome to Reading the Victorian Novel. I am Christian Lehman, and I will be your guide through these last two episodes of A Tale of Two Cities. To start, though, what greater gift than the love of a cat? Charles Dickens. Not a real quote. As Dr. Lydia Craig has shown, it is in fact quite apocryphal, owed largely to the internet, but nonetheless, it is still very fun. There are no cats in today's lessons. Not lessons in today's reading. So we are going to cover A Tale of Two Cities, the December installment, 1859. I'm going to break it up into two because the last monthly installment of Dickens's serialized works were always kind of double numbers. It was never double as in completely doubled. It was usually more like 1.5, 1.7. And today we're going to talk about Book 3, chapters 8 through 12. As a quick chapter review, we are firmly in Book the Third, The Track of the Storm, and at Chapter 8, A Hand at Cards, we learn that Barsad is Solomon, is Miss Pross's brother, and Sidney comes to town. Chapter 9, A Game Made, Cruncher and Laurie interact, and Sidney goes to the apothecary, the chemists. Chapter 10, The Substance of the Shadow, probably one of the most important chapters of the entire novel. We read Dr. Manette's confession that he had left in the Bastille. Chapter 11 and 12, you'll see, are both 5th of Novembers. They're the only paired chapter in this last set of readings. Every other one is so a complete chapter, one chapter per month. In dusk, Lucy faints, Sidney holds her, Sidney starts putting his plan into motion, and chapter 12, Darkness, Sidney spies on the Defarges. Madame Defarge's backstory is revealed. Spoiler, she has a sister, had a sister, and more plans are put into motion. But we start with Dickens giving us a pun. Very fun. Here in chapter 3-8, they, Pross and Cruncher, both looked to the right and to the left into most of the shops they passed, had a wary eye for all gregarious assemblages of people. So there's a lot of comedy that's supposed to be generated around Pross and Cruncher walking around and trying to shop. But what I like here is this use of gregarious at the start of a chapter that will reveal Barsad as the sheep of the prisons. So it's just kind of a fun pun. So to understand that, though, it's important to know that gregarious comes from Latin, a flock, right? And so it means to be part of the flock. And then we learn that Barsad is a sheep. So very, very fun. All right, another fun moment in the same chapter. This kind of meta-literary moment. Meta-literary is when the text kind of refers to textual things happening. So often, if you're reading a book, it'll be a character writing a book. But in this case, we have a really interesting example. Politely observant of the smoky lights, of the people, pipe in mouth, playing with limp cards and yellow dominoes, of the one bare-breasted, bare-armed, soot-begrimed workman reading a journal aloud, and of others listening to him. So this is a really wonderful instance of the experience of having encountered Dickens in the 19th century, right? An installment would come out, whether weekly or monthly, and you wouldn't just necessarily read it alone. Instead, you might read it to your entire family or to your group of friends. And so here, Dickens has written us a moment of a workman reading a journal aloud. And I think it's important that it is journal because all the year round was a journal. Harper's Weekly is a journal. So it's not a newspaper, right? There's a sense of something maybe a little bit different in the literary quality of what this person is reading. And then the others listening. So I've included here just one of my favorite pictures. This is Dickens reading the chimes to a bunch of friends, but it gives you a sense. They're all, of course, upper class. They're not the working men, but it's a similar kind of thing. And here they're all weeping at Dickens's powers of prose. All right, continuing on. We get a little bit of the narrative intrusion here, being sarcastic about contemporary England. This is Sidney keeps on showing these metaphorical cards of how he can manipulate Barsad and has Barsad under his thumb. It was a poorer hand than he suspected. Mr. Barsad saw losing cards in it that Sidney Carton knew nothing of. Thrown out of his honorable employment in England, though too much unsuccessful hard swearing there, dash, not because he was not wanted there. Our English reasons for vaunting our superiority to secrecy and spies are of very modern date, dash. He knew that he had crossed the channel and accepted service in France. So what I'm interested in is this kind of like dashed off parenthetical, where the narrator says our English, kind of incorporating his readership as being English, and then of very modern date. It's likely this refers to some specific treatment of spies in the late 1850s, but I don't know what that is. So Laurie tries getting on his high horse and confronting Cruncher once he learns that Cruncher has been resuscitating bodies, well, to say, resurrecting them. And Cruncher responds in kind of a convoluted paragraph, but one that's really trenchant. I hope, sir, pleaded the abashed Mr. Cruncher, that a gentleman like yourself, what I've had the honor of odd jobbing till I'm gray at it, would think twice about harming of me, even if it was so. I don't say it is, but even if it was, and which it is to be took into account, that if it was, it wouldn't even then be all on one side. There'd be two sides to it. There might be medical doctors at the present hour, a picking up their guineas, where an honest tradesman don't pick up his fardens. Fardens? No. No, yet half fardens. Half fardens? No. Nor yet his quarter. Banking away like smoke at Tellson's, and a cocking their medical eyes at that tradesman on the sly. A going in and a going out to their own carriages. Ah, equally like smoke, if not more so. Well, that'd be imposing too on Tellson's. So here, what Cruncher's doing, he's saying Laurie doesn't ask where the money's coming from. And we, in fact, have all sorts of evidence of this, right? The Tellson's is the main banker for all of these French aristocrats convicted of crimes against humanity. But Tellson's doesn't care. Hey, give us our money. We're going to look after the money. We care about the money. And Cruncher is trying to say, hey, just because you have money doesn't make somebody superior. They have enough to open a bank account in Tellson's, doesn't make them better than me. I have to make my small money, but then that medical doctor, right, he uses the body that I sell to him to make farther advances, and then you respect him. So it's really, really kind of a marvelous moment on Cruncher's part of understanding the way these global economic systems work and these social systems of the new capitalist era. We're now jumping. This is Sidney going to a chemist. And what gets set up here is we're essentially replaying Romeo and Juliet, setting up Sidney, right? He's going to be set up as Jesus. He's set up as Romeo. There's just all sorts of things. He gets set up kind of as a visitor to the underworld in a certain way. Dickens is layering every possible trope onto his body. But here's the chemist. Then traversing with the decided step of one who remembered the way well, several dark and dirty streets, much dirtier than usual, the best public thoroughfares remained uncleansed in those times of terror. He stopped at a chemist's shop, which the owner was closing with his own hands, a small, dim, crooked shop, kept in a tortuous, uphill thoroughfare by a small, dim, crooked man. So one of these marvelous moments where a person resembles the place that he inhabits, kind of a curiosity that Dickens really thrives at writing. But this is based on the visit from Romeo to the apothecary. Well, Juliet, I will lie with thee tonight. Let's see for means. Oh, mischief, thou art swift to enter in the thoughts of desperate men. I do remember an apothecary, and hereabouts he dwells, which late I noted in tattered weeds with overwhelming brows, pulling of simples, meager were his looks. Sharp misery had worn him to the bones. So here, right, that apothecary being worn to the bones, this other one being a small, dim, crooked man. Hands man, maybe a slight near rhyme, echoing those rhyming couplets that Shakespeare shifts into a little bit. Kind of, yeah, right, like dwells, brows, looks, bones, some near rhymes. Anyways, what's important here is this the shifts, right, that Sidney is going to use this medicine to put Charles to sleep, and Romeo uses the medicine to fake a death as well. So various layers being set up, not identical plot points, but adjacent, near relations. Sidney then goes on a long night walk, and this is a block of prose, but it's going to be important. It's a year later, Dickens will write a really important essay. An essay that's become increasingly important in Dickens criticism, called Night Walks. The solemn interest in the lighted windows, where the people were going to rest, forgetful through a few calm hours of the horrors surrounding them. In the towers of the churches, where no prayers were said, for the popular revulsion had even traveled that length of self-destruction from years of priestly impostors, plunderers, and profligates. In the distant burial places reserved as they wrote upon the gates for eternal sleep, in the abounding jails, and in the streets along which the 60s rolled to a death, which had become so common and material that no sorrowful story of a haunting spirit ever arose among the people out of all the working of the guillotine. With a solemn interest in the whole life and death of the city, settling down its short nightly pause in fury, Sidney Carton crossed the Seine again for the lighter streets. Few coaches were abroad, for riders and coaches were liable to be suspected, and gentility hid its head in red nightcaps and put on heavy shoes and trudged. But the theaters were all well filled, and the people poured cheerfully out as he passed and went chatting home. So what I'm interested in here, right, we have this kind of shift between two spheres. One, the deathly city, and then the other, we also find that it's inhabited and still has cultural institutions going on, the theater. Some of this is Dante-esque, right? This idea of the priestly impostors, plunderers, and profligates. That's almost like the Inferno, where we're punishing the wicked priests. And we pass through these burial places into the jails, right? The idea that a jail is like a living sleep in some ways. And we kind of just continue through. So this is Paris, but of course Paris and England are constantly paralleled. And then a few years later, Dickens will write Night Walks for all the year round, July 21st, 1860. And we just have quite a few echoes, right? Some of them might not seem too precise, right? Sure, towers of churches, burial places, cemeteries, jails, and Newgate, theaters filled, theaters empty. But what I want to underscore here is these are the things that for Dickens make up a city. And they're things that you see at night and explore the energy of a city at night. One other thing I wanted to say here, when he's talking about the gentility hiding its head in nightcaps and putting on heavy shoes and trudging, the gentility is acting, right? And then we transition to the theaters, which is also a place of acting. All right, we now come to the very important embedded document that is Dr. Manette's confession, which begins, I, Alexandre Manette, unfortunate physician, native of Beauvais, and afterwards resident in Paris, write this melancholy paper in my doleful cell in the Bastille. During the last month of the year 1767, I write it at stolen intervals under every difficulty. These words are formed by the rusty iron point with which I write with difficulty in scrapings of soot and charcoal from the chimney, mixed with blood, in the last month of the 10th year of my captivity. So the notes will point out, and it's pretty on the nose, a lot of this is based on Alexander Dumas and the Count of Monte Cristo, but then also other stories around the Bastille. But what I'm interested in is it's another moment of the meta-literary, because we have an author inside of a book that is being written, writing, and talking about the difficulty of writing and constructing a narrative. And it's a narrative that has actual consequences, right? Because of something that was written, bodies will fall. So we're now immersed in this document, and we get a problematic issue of what these aristocratic brothers have in their houses. So this is the doctor speaking. See, gentlemen, said I, still keeping my hands upon my breast, how useless I am, as you have brought me. If I had known what I was coming to see, I could have come provided. As it is, time must be lost. There are no medicines to be obtained in this lonely place. The elder brother looked to the younger, who said haughtily, there is a case of medicines here, and brought it from a closet and put it on the table. And then these stars mean that Manette had to break off his narrative. He continues, I opened some of the bottles, smelt them, and put the stoppers to my lips. If I had wanted to use anything, save narcotic medicines that were poisons in themselves, I would not have administered any of those. So these brothers keep what are essentially date rape drugs on hand, right? They keep these things that are narcotics and put others to sleep. And so it could be like self-induced, right? It could be like, oh, like they're taking it and it's putting them into a drug state. But it seems more likely, given the state of these brothers and the actions that are happening around this unnamed woman, that these are meant to render a woman pliant. And that's this kind of convoluted grammar, right? To reword it, if I had wanted to use anything except narcotic medicines that were poisons, I would not have administered them. But he wants to use narcotic medicine. So he does. He uses these wicked drugs that the brothers have on hand. So this is the third of the major changes that happened between the manuscript and the published version. So I want to just kind of look at these quickly. You want to pause, you can, to see it more clearly. But on the right is what gets printed, and on the left is the manuscript. And everything highlighted is that which is identical. And the first thing that you'll see is the shift in the girl. So we go from, she was a good girl. She was betrothed, she was a good girl not long ago and had a good lover. She deceived him for this man's brother, the worst of a bad race. So in the manuscript, the girl goes, betrays herself, right? She betrays the lover and kind of like of her own free will runs off with the aristocrat. In the printed version, she was a good girl. She was betrothed to a good young man too, a tenant of his. We were all tenants of his. That man's who stands there. The other is his brother, right? So she ends up being stolen and taken away in the printed version. But the key thing that gets added is this idea of the tenantship. Because throughout, and we're going to see this on the next slide, the printed version really emphasizes the class difference between the two of them and the abuse between the upper class and the lower class, between the aristocratic and the peasant class. So back in the manuscript, right, we continue this idea of her loving that man, whereas in that published, we really keep hitting this idea of being robbed. They're common dogs. They are superior beings. But this girl, this version of the sister, she marries and sticks with him even in her illness. So then the two brothers try to make his life miserable, and they continue doing it. Ultimately, with that man's permission and even with his aid, his brother took her away in spite of what she must have told his brother, right? So here it's very much a case of stealing the woman, raping the woman. And what she must have told the brother isn't just that she doesn't love him, right? And she loves her husband. It's that she's pregnant. And it's for this reason that the father's heart bursts. So these are these big differences that happen. And just kind of emphasizing again, we have this line here that I'll come back to. I took my young sister, for I have another, to a place beyond the reach of this man. So we add in a second sister that's there. And that's going to become important because that will be Madame Defarge's sister. All right. So back out, this is now the next chapter, Dusk. Sidney has this little narrative intrusion. Lucy has fainted. And he says, before I go, he said, and paused, I may kiss her. It was remembered afterwards, right? So there's a narrator intruding, telling us more of this futuristic stuff, but lending a lot of weight to this particular kiss. That when he bent down and touched her face with his lips, he murmured some words. The child who was nearest him told them afterwards, and told her grandchildren, when she was a handsome old lady, that she heard him say, a life you love. So this is Sidney quoting himself from back in book 2, chapter 13. Oh, Miss Manette, when the little picture of a happy father's face looks up in yours, when you see your own bright beauty springing up anew at your feet, think now and then that there is a man who would give his life to keep a life you love beside you. So Sidney's been like waiting to sacrifice himself this whole time. Sacrificial lamb, if we want to use some of the language of the flock. And this is where we get, now we're shifting to Madame Defarge's connection. So in the next chapter. I communicate to him that secret. I smite this bosom with these two hands as I smite it now, and I tell him, Defarge, I was brought up among the fishermen of the seashore, and that peasant family so injured by the two Evrémonde brothers, as the Bastille paper describes, is my family. Defarge, that sister of the mortally wounded boy upon the ground, was my sister. That husband was my sister's husband. That unborn child was their child. That brother was my brother. That father was my father. Those dead are my dead. And that summons to answer for those things descends to me. So you remember, this sister did not exist before. Dickens had added her in the manuscript. And so we see some of these things building, right? Now we give motivation to Madame Defarge's desire for revenge, which makes her a much stronger character. And I think it also contrasts really strongly with an earlier moment with Lucy. So she says, that sister of the mortally wounded boy upon the ground is my sister. Earlier, Lucy tried to make a connection with her by saying, oh, sister woman, think of me as a wife and mother. Well, she has. Madame Defarge has. She is thinking of wives and mothers and sisters. It just so happens that her motivation for her hatred towards Lucy comes from those very thoughts that Lucy is trying to bring up. And so Defarge had answered at that time, the wives and mothers we have been used to see since we were as little as this child, and much less, have not been greatly considered. We have known their husbands and fathers laid in prison and kept from them often enough. All our lives, we have seen our sister women suffer in themselves and in their children, poverty, nakedness, hunger, thirst, sickness, misery, oppression, and neglect of all kinds. So there's more here that's happening. It's kind of about class. I mean, it's definitely about class. It's also about nationhood and these ideas of loyalty, right? Like, is being a sister woman, is being a woman enough to create a connection? Or does that blood genealogy matter more? Right. We are now jumping to the illustrations. So here, this is Fizz's illustration of the identity of Barsad. So here's Barsad turning, there's Prost, there's Cruncher, comically astonished to see him being alive. And over here, we have that meta-literary moment of the man reading, not at all looking like he ought to, quote unquote, ought to. This is dusk. This is Sydney holding Manette. Here is Alexander being astonished and helpless. Laurie then is over here. What I'm interested in, though, is this body position, right? We are kind of putting Lucy in a sexualized position of vulnerability. So her hair falls down and loose. You can see a hint of her bosom because of the cut of the dress. Sydney's hands clench around her, right? Kind of stares down at her neck. Her mouth is facing out to the audience. There's just a lot of damsel visual language that's set up here. More ways in which we are evacuating Lucy of any agency. Jumping now, this is McLenan's illustrations. So here is McLenan's version of the strong bare-armed man reading and everybody kind of listening, paying attention, kind of like some ape-like arms here, the figures with their pole arms. Here, this version of Cruncher, very threatening, grasping the shoulder, pulling Barsad up towards him. Then we have Sydney and Laurie. Pay attention to what Sydney looks like here because we're going to get a very different version there. I like this little paunch that he has. Here's just a comparison, right? So in the text, it said, of the bare-breasted, bare-armed, soot-begrimed workman reading a journal aloud and of the others listening to him. This nerd doesn't fit that at all. This guy, he's kind of filling in there, and especially the kind of paying attention, whereas these figures are all looking to see what the hubbub is about. Here is the game made. So here's Cruncher confronting Laurie, that great quote we had. And this is Dr. Manette's confession that it's about to be read. A really powerful moment with the bodies being blurred out in the background and the text popping out on the page. The substance of the shadow. These are the two illustrations that go with the confession. Here is the doctor and the two Evrémonde brothers. Here is the small boy. I love how helpless they make him look, being held up. This shadow right here might be the the attack, the point from the sword with the other darkly swathed Evermond brother who had cut him through. Then dusk, here's Manette kind of panicking, and Laurie and Sydney trying to figure things out. I swear to you, like Evermond, this, right, there's Madame Defarge. This is supposed to be Sydney, where he's pretending not to know anything, a very unsexy version of Sydney. All right, so a few things. There's a few really noteworthy events that happen in this sequence of Harpers in which these are published. The first, there's a summary of the Franklin expedition because of a confession that was found and then sent out. So the Franklin expedition was an expedition to the Arctic where everybody died. And there was a lot of debate over whether there was cannibalism. And Dickens was really invested in this. And it was 10 years earlier. And what ends up happening, well, 12 years earlier, is Dickens writes a play with Wilkie Collins called The Frozen Deep that I'm going to talk about in my last video, heavily influenced by it, but it's also heavily lays the pattern of Sidney, Darnay, Lucy, and that triangulation of sacrificing yourself for a lover. So it's just a curiosity that this gets published. Really some cool illustrations came out with it. I mean, Harper's, if you haven't checked it out, you got to check it out for its illustrations. But the other huge event that happened is John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry. And this is just like parallel with everything you're reading about the French Revolution. If you're in America, you're reading about John Brown and Harper's Ferry and the kind of like laying down the early patterns of what will become the Civil War. And it's striking, right? You started reading A Tale of Two Cities in Harper's with the Italian Risorgimento happening, and then you're concluding A Tale of Two Cities with this attack on Harper's Ferry. And lastly, what gets announced is an early number of Harper's Weekly, a new serial tale by Wilkie Collins, of which we have purchased the advanced proof sheets from the author. This tale will be continued through the weekly till it is completed. This will be Woman in White. And with that, we come to an end, and we will pick up next time with the conclusion of A Tale of Two Cities.